Hi everybody, welcome to the Splendid Sampler to Sew Along with me, Jenni Smith. This week's block is called Flower Child. It's been designed for fusible, appliqué, however you say it. I still don't know after all these weeks. So in that sense it makes it a little bit quicker than needle turn, and I think because there's quite complicated shapes and a lot of them, lots of people will be choosing the fusible option. That's what I'm going to do, with some nice blanket stitch on the machine around the edge. When you look at the picture here, the cream background is actually made up of 4 squares if you want it to be, but I've got a really lovely fabric that I'm just going to use. I think there's already a lot going on, so I'm going to ignore the first step of actually piecing these 4 squares together, which obviously you'll be able to do easily. I'm just going to cut my cream square at 6.5 inches. In fact, I've already done that, it's here. So here it is, and because it's fusible web that we're using, and then I'm doing some stitching on the machine like on my other blocks. I've put a lightweight interface in already that I've also cut to 6.5 inches on the back, and then it's a case of snowball corners, which I'll show you a nice trick for now, and then working on the design in the center. So stick with me for the rest of the video. Snowball corners. So I've got my squares here, I've got my background. I'm just going to square them up like so. I'm going to put my needle in on that corner. I have got the bottom corner lined up with my washi tape here, or tape which is in line with the needle position, and then I can simply keep my eye, ignore the needle, keep my eye on that bottom corner, that stays aligned with the washi tape as I go along. So I've no need to mark these corners, carry it along. And that's all stitched. When transferring the design, you don't have to add seam allowance unless you're doing needle turn appliqué. So you are copying this shape, but what you have to ensure when you're drawing it through onto the smooth side of your fusible web, whether it's Flies-A-Fix or heat and bond like I'm using, is just to ensure that you leave enough gaps here so that you can cut this out not entirely to the line first of all and get it on the wrong side of your fabric, and then cut out your exact shape. The good thing is you don't have to worry about direction, because even if you split this design right down the middle, it would be symmetrical, and therefore you're not having to flip the templates or anything like that. All I would say is that I would check once you've cut them out of fabric that you ensure that they are exact and mirror each other as well before you start to stick them down onto the background. So I've now got all of my pieces cut out roughly. Obviously it doesn't matter, you don't want to waste too much of your heat and bond, but otherwise you don't have to be too exact at this stage, just to get them onto the wrong side of your fabrics, and then you can now go in and cut out exactly on the line. And like I said, just ensure, like, fold the fabric back at that stage, just make sure your heart and everything is symmetrical, and then I can peel the back off, flip and press. Okay, so the good thing again when it's appliqué is that you can cut out your shapes. You're not wasting huge amounts of fabrics when the blocks are this size, and if for any reason you don't like the colour combinations, you can obviously change them before committing and sticking them down and then doing the stitching. I've gone for a little bit of liberty on the yellow, but I've then used some oak shot pieces of fabric that I had, just because I've been doing lots of pattern on pattern on pattern, but I did really feel like I wanted to just use some plainer fabrics as well, and then the prints can sing around the edge. Because I haven't pieced my cream square, then I haven't got the lines to centre the design from, but you can measure in and figure that out easily enough. And actually I'm guessing, because I haven't got the bulk of the seams behind, it's going to be slightly easier to stick these shapes in place. One editorial decision I've made is that I'm actually not going to cut out and use these very small ellipses of red here or any other colour, just because they're so slim that I know when I come to machine applique, that's potentially quite a vulnerable bit, because even if it's stuck down it could shift. I'm not sure the blanket stitch would go right around both sides, and really I'm going to leave them out just because I think the design works really well as it is. I'm not sure they give that much more to it, so I'm going to stick with these. So I'm going to peel off the backs and stick them down. In terms of placement then, so the heart kind of nestles within this here, so that if this line continued, it looks to just be slightly above the top edge of the heart there. And then you've got a little bit of negative space of background between these two. They nearly meet in the middle here. And then down the bottom, the larger leaves are quite close, about 1/4 of an inch, from, as I can gather anyway from the diagram, they're about 1/4 of an inch here, and then very close to the bottom, but obviously you're leaving your seam allowance. I'm going to stitch around those and then put the centre on top afterwards, like that. So that's just a little guide how I laid them out. I've got this nice selection of Aurifil 40 weights, so that's the just one up from the orange spools, which lots of people use in quilting for piecing and for machine quilting. So they're just a little bit heavier, a little bit stronger, but on the machine for a blanket stitch, then they're going to give just that little bit more definition. And because I've got lots of colours, then it means I can obviously mix and match around the different shapes in my design that I'm using. I'll use 40 weight in the bobbin as well, and because I've interfaced the back of my block, I shouldn't really get any bunching or puckering as I go. In terms of blanket stitch, on this Janome, which I use, it's a 605, then I've got various options here just to try out, so I'll sample those before I decide obviously what's going to work and what stitch length I want to get around those shapes. Some of them are quite small, so that needs to be considered. I might change it up or down on the different pieces. I've also got my fancier horizon here, but I'll try them out and then decide which one. So I've machine blanket stitched with the Aurifil 40 weight around the leaves here. Obviously it's just a case of practicing with the stitch length if you're doing it on your machine, and stopping and pivoting as you go around the tighter curves. For this narrower section here on the blue, I'm just going to change it slightly, so you may not have a fancy machine, but my machine here, I've chosen a blanket stitch, and I can actually alter the width and the length, the distance. So I don't want my sideways stitches, my horizontal stitches, to come in quite as far, and I want a greater distance between them because I'm going around a long narrow shape here. So I've just done a little practice run and altered that before I start this one. So it's a bit trial and error, I think, on this machine. Some bits are definitely neater than others for me. On the skinnier shapes, I found it just to come in a little bit. It's when you're turning your corners and your angles, it's just making sure you're on the right part of the stitch, on the blanket stitch, so that it's not going backwards next as you carry on round. And almost I'm going quite slowly, and after each stitch pausing and just keeping the needle down but lifting the foot and just pivoting slightly to get around the bend. So now that I've stitched around everything around here, I've just pressed the centre of the flower on so that I can machine round that, and then obviously any finishing off is hidden beneath it, and then I am done. So this is the block all done. It looks a bit Scandinavian, so I've put it on my nice Marimekko fabric bench in my sewing studio to photograph. So I've stitched all round those now with the machine blanket stitch. Like I say, initially I missed off just the skinnier pieces of red here, but I like the overall look of it, so I am happy with that. The 40 weight Aurifil worked nicely, and if I just flip it over, you can see that the interfacing did help to avoid any of the stitches puckering, and I've just had a 50 weight thread on the bobbin, and the tension's correct because none of that's coming through to the front of the block. So there we go.